Hello, everyone. My name is Ruby Maharo. I'm the MCC programmer. I'd like to invite you to some of our upcoming events. This Saturday, we have a children's event, Tales of the Ashanti. On Monday, we'll have a discussion with Ingrid Deneen Wimberly. And on Wednesday, we will have Cultures of Resistance, a free screening here in the MCC Theater. I'd now like to invite Zavini Khan Marcus to the stage to introduce Varun. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you all here. I know we are a small group, but the presentation is going to be excellent, and thank you all for being here. I would like to acknowledge our co-sponsors first. The Interfaith Initiative of Santa Barbara County, the Interfaith Interns, ACE Community Affairs Board, the Religious Studies Department, and the University Religious Center Interfaith Fund. I'm very excited now and honored to have this evening's speaker here at the MCC. I'd like to welcome Dr. Varun Soni and his lovely wife, Shakti. Welcome. So Dr. Varun Soni is the first Hindu in American history to serve as a Dean of Religious Life at the University of Southern California. This is amazing. And he received his master's in religious studies here at UCSB. And it turns out that he took sitar lessons from my husband, Scott Marcus, in the music department. He spent 4 years also teaching in UCSB's Law and Society program. Dr. Soni received his BA from Tufts University, MTS from Harvard Divinity School, and JD from UCLA School of Law. He earned his Ph.D. in religious studies from the University of Cape Town, where his doctoral research focused on religion, technology, and popular culture. As a national interfaith leader, he has organized and hosted many programs and events with prominent spiritual leaders like His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama of Tibet. He's also in the advisory board for the Center for Muslim-Jewish Engagement, Cross Currents, Journal for Interreligious Dialogue, Hindu American Seva Charities, Truly Christian Media, Interfaith Youth Corps, and the Parliament of the World Religions. Now please join me in welcoming Dr. Varun Soni.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm really honored to be here at the MCC at UCSB. I spent many, many wonderful years of my life living in Santa Barbara. I was a graduate student here. I first came here in 1999 to do a PhD in the Department of Religious Studies. I think you have the best religious studies program in the country right here at UCSB. I remember the time I was living up in Mission Canyon. I had a nice little convertible. I used to wake up in the morning with the birds, look out on the ocean, drive the convertible down to campus, talk about religion. I thought, man, I've peaked way too early because it's never going to get better than this. I was only in my early 20s, and I already realized that I was living the best part of my life. After law school, I came here and taught full-time for 4 years. I'm really grateful to Professor Kathy Moore, the Law and Society program. It was really here where I learned to teach, I learned to think. I was given classes with 200 students, and it really challenged me to sort of step up to the plate. I always thought of Santa Barbara as a pure land. For the Buddhists, the pure land is the celestial realm filled with beauty and bodhisattvas. And my friend Pico Iyer, who's a well-known Santa Barbara resident, a really great writer, whenever I meet with him, we just talk about Santa Barbara. That's all we talk about. He lives in Kyoto now, but he occasionally comes through. And we talk about how much we miss La Superica. So I just took my wife there for lunch. And when I got married to my wife, Shakti, who's here, she's from South Africa. And her parents were very reluctant to let her leave South Africa and move to the United States, especially to live with someone, to marry someone they didn't know. And at the time I was teaching at UCSB, and I told her father and her mother and her whole family, well, I live in Santa Barbara. I figured they'd never heard of it. It's a small town. But there was this famous soap opera called Santa Barbara, which was really popular in South Africa. And because I lived in Santa Barbara and they were familiar with the soap opera, they let her move here and marry me. So I have Santa Barbara to thank for that, and she has Santa Barbara to blame for that. But it's a long way of saying that I'm really grateful to be here. I'm honored to be back at the MCC. I used to do events here myself when I was a graduate student. I feel like I'm coming full circle, so thank you for having me. Today I'm going to share some reflections with you about interfaith, both as an organized movement and also as a mode of consciousness. In particular, I'm interested in the future of interfaith, both in terms of its challenges and its opportunities. But I think to understand the future of interfaith, we really have to begin by looking at the past. Interfaith is one of those words like globalization. It's a buzzword that people are talking about now, and it suggests that somehow this is a new idea, that globalization is this new phenomenon, as Thomas Friedman will talk about it, or that interfaith is a new phenomenon, as someone like Ibu Patel might conceive of it. But globalization and interfaith are as old as human civilization itself. The history of mankind is really the history of an exchange of ideas and culture and beliefs and goods. And all of the major religions in the world today really emerge out of an interfaith encounter. They all have their root in some kind of interfaith conversation. We think of religion in the West especially in neat categories that don't really impact each other, but the boundaries aren't that clear. They all kind of bleed into one another. And if we look at, for example, our Abrahamic traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, we see how they really emerge out of a common context. The Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, borrows from the Babylonian and Egyptian texts of its time. The Christian Bible emerges then from the Tanakh and is also shaped by Zoroastrianism and Gnostic beliefs. The Quran incorporates biblical narratives from both Judaism and Christianity and holds those prophetic lineages as authoritative. So Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are the fruit of an interfaith encounter. They're not monolithic traditions coming out in a vacuum. And we've seen this throughout history, interesting cultural fusion, which brings the Abrahamic traditions together. My wife and I were in Andalusia, south of Spain last year. We were in Cordova, Granada, and Sevilla. And you really see architecture, music, rituals, and even theology, this fruitful exchange between faiths, this peaceful coexisting, this blossoming and flourishing of faith. And I think that is interfaith. We see this with the Dharma traditions too, the uniquely Indian religions of Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism. They all emerge out of a Vedic context. They all accept a particular framework, even though they disagree on the particulars of that framework. And throughout history, they're in conversation with each other. They're debating each other. They're shaping each other. In fact, Sikhism, the newest of the Dharmic traditions, really emerges out of a critique of Hinduism and Islam and incorporates elements of both. And in the Guru Granth Sahib, which is the Sikh the holiest scripture for Sikhs, it includes poetry that is written by poets who we now consider Hindu and Muslim. So we have poets that are codified in the holiest text who aren't of the tradition. In the Mughal Empire, around the same time as the sort of interfaith encounter in Andalusia, the Mughal Empire is a syncretic blend of Hindu and Muslim culture, especially under Akbar, who had a vision of an interfaith empire. He even started his own religion for the court called Din-e-Ala'i, which brings together the Dharma traditions of India with the Abrahamic traditions of the Middle East. So interfaith is not new, even though the buzz around it makes it seem like it's new. But there is something new about it in the American context. There's a new permutation. It is now its own movement and worldview. There are interfaith councils in virtually every American city, major American city. Religious congregations are increasingly interreligious in their outreach, in their liturgy, and in their worship. There are academic programs focused on interfaith leadership. And people now have started to self-identify as interfaith as their root religious tradition. So there is this emergence of interfaith as a discrete category and ideology. And we also see with that a new type of religious literacy where Americans know more about other faiths than they've ever known before. And all this is taking place with the backdrop of a rapidly changing religiosity in the United States. We are at a significant moment in American history in terms of our religious culture. For the first time, less than 50% of the United States is Protestant. It was always a majority Protestant country, but that's no longer the case. We saw that recently, say, with the Supreme Court appointments, the most recent one of Justice Kagan. There are no Protestants on the Supreme Court. It used to be the case that there was like a Jewish seat on the Supreme Court and a Catholic seat on the Supreme Court. Now there's not even a Protestant seat on the Supreme Court. I think that's one example of how the demographic in the United States is changing considerably. In the last presidential campaign, this most recent one, President Obama was the only Protestant of the 4 major candidates on the ticket. Of course, Joe Biden, Paul Ryan were Catholic, Mitt Romney is Mormon. And Barack Obama was the Protestant, even though many people in this country don't even believe he's Christian. He was the sole Protestant. And in some states, like our own in California, we are now less than 50% white. So the notion of the United States as a white Protestant country, a majority white Protestant country, no longer holds true. There's a tremendous rise in geo-religious diversity, too. It's not just that we have Muslims and Christians and Jews and Buddhists in this country, but we have Muslims from all over the Muslim world. We have Buddhists from all over the Buddhist world. There are more types of Buddhists in Los Angeles than there are in Bangkok, making Los Angeles one of the great Buddhist cities in human history, even though we don't often think of it that way. So with the rise of these immigrant religions and also new American religions like the Church of Latter-day Saints, Pentecostalism, we see a very different American religious demographic. 1/3 of all marriages in the United States are now happening between people of different faiths. They're interfaith marriages, and that number is actually 1/2, but many people will convert to the tradition of their partner, so it brings it down to 1/3. But 1/3 of new marriages are interfaith marriages. So the change in the religious demographic is shaping, I think, the future of interfaith. And another big, very important trend that goes along with sort of the decline of Protestantism in the public sphere is the rise of those who do not affiliate with any tradition at all. And you've probably heard about this through the new Pew surveys on religion and public life. We call this group the nuns, not N-U-Ns, but N-O-N-Es, no religious affiliation at all. In 1950, 2% of Americans were not affiliated with any formal religious tradition, 2%. Today, more than 20% of Americans are not affiliated with any religious tradition. And for those under 30, it's 35%. 35% of people in the United States who are under 30 do not formally affiliate with any religious tradition at all. And so with the rise of the nuns, we also see the rise of another group called, we call SBNR, spiritual but not religious. So many people in our country now self-identify as spiritual but not religious. And 2/3 of college students identify as more spiritual than religious. So I think these two trends in particular, the rise of the nuns, the rise of the SBNRs, in conjunction with the decline of public Protestantism, gives us a very different America than we've seen in the past. And what I see is a mega trend happening here. I see that, not just in the United States, but around the world, that there's this large movement from organized religion to personal spirituality, from institutions to individuals. I think that's probably a good way to put it, that people are disaffiliating with institutional religion, but that doesn't mean they're not interested in ultimate concerns of their life. They're still deeply interested in meaning and purpose and identity. And with this movement from institutions to individuals, I think we see something that is worth discussing in terms of the new religious landscape in the United States in 3 realms: the change in religious leadership, the change in religious identity, and the change in religious meaning. So in terms of leadership, in the absence of organized religion, the notion of clergy changes tremendously, especially for those who are under 30. You know, our students, they're not going to go see a movie because Roger Ebert liked the movie. They're going to go see a movie because their friends on Facebook like the movie. And similarly, I find they've put less sort of, give less sort of credibility to clergy. They're not going to explore religious faith or culture because a priest or an imam or a rabbi says to. They're going to do it because their friends are interested or turn them on to that. And I think what we've seen is a new type of religious leadership, especially geared towards those under 30. I think the best example of this is a man named Amr Khaled, the most influential Muslim televangelist in the world. He comes out of Egypt, which is 60% of Egypt under the age of 30. But he's really popular all over the Arab world. He has literally millions and millions of followers. But what was his training? You know, he's about 40 years old, maybe a little older. What was his training? He's not a traditional imam. He didn't go to an Islamic seminary. He doesn't have a beard or wear the accoutrements of traditional clergy. Instead, he was the former director of KPMG for the Middle East. And because he doesn't have a traditional religious background, and because he's engaged in worldly activities, I think he has more legitimacy amongst the youth than had he been a traditional imam. In our country, arguably the most important, or at least the most influential spiritual leader, is not trained as clergy. That is Oprah Winfrey. This wonderful religious scholar from Yale, Catherine Lofton, wrote a book last year called Oprah, The Gospel of an Icon. And she argues that Oprah is a significant American religious figure because she challenges us to think deeply about the enduring human questions in our life, the questions of meaning and purpose and authenticity. In a way, she's a prophetic voice for compassion and acceptance and forgiveness and justice, themes that are central and shared by all of our religious faiths. But she has no formal religion, and she has no formal religious training, and that allows her to cross over traditional divides of religion, of nationality, of ethnicity, of race, of gender, etc. I saw this in my own life. I'm the Dean of Religious Life at USC. I'm essentially the university chaplain. All of my colleagues around the country are ordained Protestant ministers. I'm a non-ordained Hindu attorney. It's a very different model. USC really kind of thought outside the box there. I think because of that, because I've started a business, because I'm an attorney, because I've lived as a Buddhist monk, but I'm a Hindu, I have a certain amount of, I feel like I'm able to speak to students in a different way than sort of the traditional university chaplain model. USC did a feature on me in the Trojan Family magazine, and they called it the unchaplain. And I thought that was hilarious, because in what other field would not having a degree in that field qualify you for that field? In a way, they were promoting me as something unique because I wasn't ordained clergy, but I am the university chaplain. I can't imagine a situation where you go into an operating room and someone says, here's your doctor, the non-physician who's never been to medical school, or here's your lawyer who's going to argue the case, the unlawyer. But for some reason, in the religious context, that is not only acceptable, it gives, I think, me a certain amount of legitimacy or a different kind of angle to talk about certain issues. We live in a country now where Tim Tebow is probably one of the more well-known and respected youth evangelical leaders. When his pastor speaks, several hundred people will come. But when Tim Tebow speaks, 20,000 people come to church to hear him speak. So we have a very different idea now, I think, for youth as to what constitutes a religious leader. And meanwhile, traditional divinity schools are struggling to stay open. Catholic nuns are on a serious decline. Houses of worship like synagogues and mainline Protestant churches are increasingly older, over 65. Every time I go into a house of worship, no matter who it is, except for, I think, for Mormons and Muslims seem to have good youth attendance, but everyone else, Christians, Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, they all ask me the same question. How do we get young people to come to church? How do we get young people to come to synagogue? I don't know if they'll ever go back to synagogue or church in the same way that their parents or grandparents did. So I think this changing religiosity in the United States really challenges traditional notions of who is a religious leader and what does religious clergy mean. The second point is religious identity. In the West, we think of religion as a matter of belief or practice in a confessional way. I am a Hindu because I believe X. I am a Hindu because I do Y, or I perform Y. But I think for most people in the world, religion is not so much a function of belief or belief or practice, but rather a function of identity. The statement, I am a Hindu, I am a Muslim, I am a Christian, is a statement about self-identification in the same way that we self-identify with nationality, ethnicity, and sexual orientation. So even though 70% of Americans self-identify as Christian, not 70% of Americans are going to church every weekend. I don't think 70% of Americans are engaged in critical Bible study, but they still deeply feel Christian. And I saw that with my own family growing up. I grew up in a very secular Hindu family. I come from a family of physicians. I have 11 physicians in my family, so my Ph.D. means nothing. Like, they don't even call me doctor in my family. But anyway, with my family, we never grew up going to temple. We didn't really study scripture. We didn't really pray. But everyone in my family self-identifies as Hindu, and if you say something negative about Hindus, then they will react, even though they're not practicing, even though they're not studying. So for them, and I think for many, really religion is a mode of identification more than it is a mode of belief or practice. And that's also because there is no singular belief or practice that unifies all people of every faith. There's over 30,000 denominations of Christianity. There's many different types of Islams and Judaisms. Hinduism is a very decentralized tradition. It's predicated on the idea of many path, one truth. So to say that you are a Christian or a Muslim because you believe X or do Y doesn't really work in terms of how you define those traditions as being extremely pluralistic. But to say I am a Christian because I self-identify as a Christian, well, that allows everyone to sort of come up with their own religious identity. And so what I've seen happening is a shift in the way people identify themselves, especially those under 30. So our students at USC, and I imagine students here at UCSB, our students on our Interfaith Council, they are self-identifying as members of all faith traditions, but we also have students who are pagan and Wiccan. We have students who belong to the Church of the Jedi. We have a student who self-identifies as Zen Christian. And my favorite is this new category I keep hearing, students who say, I'm trans-spiritual. I don't know what that means, but it sounds so cool. Like, I want to be trans-spiritual. But what I see is that people are comfortable with hybridized identities. They're comfortable with non-denominational identities. They're comfortable with these new proactive self-identities, these creative identities about what it means to be religious in the United States today. And the third area where I think we see things shifting is in religious meaning. How do people find meaning in a world where so many people aren't going to worship services or who have disaffiliated from formal religion? And what I said earlier, I think is worth repeating, is that even though people are disaffiliating with religion in record numbers, the quest and the thirst for meaning and purpose and identity and authenticity is still so strong. Just because people leave the church doesn't mean they leave the quest to answer those questions. So what we see for our students, those under 30, they're the first generation in American history to list meaning as one of the top things they want out of their careers. We've never seen that before. Their parents may have looked for security or stability or a job that would help them with their family life or give them some kind of satisfaction, but not meaning. Our students want to find meaning not just in their life, but in their work. They don't just want to be business folks. They want to be social entrepreneurs. They just don't want to be physicians. They want to be global healthcare practitioners. My law students don't just want to practice law. They want to do pro bono work. So I think part and parcel of that idea is we find meaning through some kind of service orientation, and that's not just something we do in our personal lives. That's something we do in our professional lives. I also think popular culture has become a church in and of itself. My Ph.D. advisor, who was an alum of the Religious Studies program here at UCSB, David Chittister, wrote a great book called Authentic Fakes, Religion in American Popular Culture. And he argues that Elvis Presley, Disneyland, McDonald's, Nike, Coca-Cola, these global icons of American popular culture all have religious power now in the United States. They are sacred relics and places for our day and age. I think for many of us, the mythology that we find in our religious texts is being reenacted in different ways through cinema. Cinema is the storytelling platform of our time. Cinema wrestles deeply with these spiritual questions. I mean, all you have to do is look at this year's Best Picture nominees, and you'll see that they're deeply religious at their core. Life of Pi, for example, is an interfaith movie that struggles with the question of theodicy. How do we reconcile a benevolent God in the midst of human suffering? Argo and Zero Dark 30 focus a lot, on religious extremism. Lincoln focuses on prophetic themes of morality and justice and equality. The Beast of the Southern Wild is like a prayer. It's like a poem, focusing on mystery and childlike wonder. Django Unchained is about righteousness and retribution and redemption. Amour is a film about faith, commitment, and mortality. These are themes that are at the heart of all of our religious texts, at the heart of all of our religious myths. But in the absence of a public conversation about them, I think people are consuming these ideas, finding meaning through film. And sports is a huge one. When I got to USC, everyone said, well, you're the dean of religious life, you should know the real religion here is football. And I thought it was a joke, and I realized after a while that it wasn't a joke, that what I see on our campus looks like religion. When there's a USC football game, there's a pilgrimage to the Colosseum. People have rituals. People have songs. There's a sense of transcendence. There's celebration. There's sorrow. People are wearing funny hats. They connect with a mythology that predates them. And so I think if we think of religion as a type of tribal identity, well, then we don't see that anywhere better than in sports. I mean, 110 million people watched the Super Bowl this Sunday. I don't think 110 million people went to a house of worship this week. And it's not just in the United States. I think of Pakistan, for example. Pakistan, I feel cricket has provided an ideological glue for Pakistan in a way that Islam has not been able to do. If you know the history of Pakistan, you know that it was once two countries, East and West Pakistan, with the idea that somehow Islam would be an ideological glue that would keep them together. But in 1971, East Pakistan became Bangladesh. And now in Pakistan, we have a lot of sectarian violence directed towards Muslim minority communities like the Sufis, the Ahmadiyas, the Shias. But cricket brings everyone together. In Pakistan, there's been so much trouble recently. There have been floods, there's been religious extremism, there's been, a lot of stuff in the news about the displaced people of Swat. But what really brought the country, political corruption, but what really brought the country to its knees was match fixing in cricket. That was what really, I think, people got upset about, protested about, etc. I just hosted Imran Khan, who was the cricket captain for Pakistan in 1993. They won the World Cup. Now he's running for prime minister. I will be the next prime minister of Pakistan in April. And when he came to speak to folks at USC, 80% of his stump speech was about how he won the World Cup of cricket and how that was the greatest moment for Pakistan. And people love that. Even though he's not traditionally Muslim, he has this playboy past, he was married to a billionaire, etc. Cricket, in some ways, for India and for Pakistan, has become a new religion. And I saw this firsthand when I went to the World Cup in South Africa in 2010, FIFA. My wife's from South Africa. And it was this incredible moment of Pan-Africanism. Like, we've talked about political Pan-Africanism, African unity. I've read all the great sort of theorists about this, like Kwame Nkrumah, but I've never seen it like I saw it in South Africa, where there was such great pride and jubilation and celebration that such a big event was being hosted on the African continent. So I think as those who non-affiliate rise, the numbers rise, those who are atheists, agnostic, SBNRs rise, coupled with the development of digital media, global consumption, popular culture will increasingly play the role of organized religion in terms of music, art, cinema, sports, and fashion. It's become a global language that really connects us all together. So given the changing nature of religion in the United States, what is the future of interfaith? That's the topic of tonight's talk. I believe the future of interfaith in the United States rests on two trends. The first is millennial engagement with interfaith, and the second is religious engagement with secular institutions. So I'll talk about millennials now, and I've been talking about them actually all evening. Millennials are those who are basically born after 1982, those who are under 30 years old. I call them the post-Thriller generation because they were born after the release of the Michael Jackson album Thriller. Most religious scholars see the world in terms of before Christ and after Christ. I see the world in terms of before Thriller and after Thriller. So they're the post-Thriller generation. And they're the majority of the world. We live in a very young world. More than half of the world is under the age of 30. More than 60% of the Muslim world is under the age of 30. More than 60% of Indians and Chinese are under the age of 30. So millennials are a huge population. We're talking about more than 3 billion people and the most diverse generation in human history. In the US, millennials are the most multicultural, multi-faith, multidisciplinary generation in our history. In their first real election, millennials changed the world in 2008 by organizing and driving the campaign of Barack Obama, especially in the critical states of the critical caucuses and primaries in the swing states. They're technologically savvy, they're socially engaged, they're optimistic about the future. Some even describe them as a post-racial generation, where traditional divisions of race and ethnicity do not shape their worldviews as they have done with previous generations. My colleague at USC, Maury Winograd, gives an example in his book, Millennial Makeover. His friend had a daughter who's a millennial, and his friend was telling him, for months, her daughter was saying, "You got to meet my boyfriend, you got to meet my boyfriend," and told her all about her boyfriend. For 6 months, she was talking every day about, my boyfriend does this, and my boyfriend does that, and he's so cool, and this and that. And this is a white American family. And when the mother finally met the boyfriend, she was surprised, not disappointed, but surprised to find that that her boyfriend was Korean American, and it had never come up in 6 months. I think for me, as Generation X, that's something that would have come up. For her as a baby boomer, that's definitely something that would have come up. But for millennials, it didn't even matter to her daughter that her boyfriend was of a different ethnicity. It didn't matter enough to even talk about it. It certainly didn't impact her relationship in any way. One of the defining characteristics of this generation is their desire to serve. Millennials do have a different approach to religion and spirituality than their parents. They're less interested in dogma, less interested in doctrine, less interested in liturgy. They're more interested in service. They're more interested in personal experience. They're comfortable about learning from each other's faiths in a way that strengthens their own. And they're deeply invested, like I said, in community service and community empowerment, and that's where they find meaning, and that's where they find God. They are suspicious of organized religion. They're no longer attending religious services the way they used to. At USC, I oversee more student religious groups than any university in the country. We have over 100 religious groups and over 50 campus chaplains. We have 40 evangelical groups on our campus. But I know that 65% of evangelicals will leave the church before they're 35. 65%. USC has over 10,000 Catholic students. We just built this stunning new $40 million Crusoe Catholic Center. But I know that only a few hundred of them will attend Mass during the week. So, like I said earlier, every religious leader asks me about how to get young people back into church, especially I find this with the mainline Protestant traditions. But the reality is that they may never come back to church. But they are developing a new type of interfaith consciousness, and I think that was what will determine the future of interfaith in the United States. And they're doing it on university campuses. I think the university campus is a really unique location for this type of encounter. In his acclaimed book, which you might have read, The Post-American World by Fareed Zakaria, he highlights how traditional domains of U.S. power, such as industry and infrastructure and innovation, are on the decline in the U.S. and on the rise elsewhere. Indeed, the biggest film industry in the world is in India. The biggest renewable energy industry is in China. The biggest malls in the world are in Dubai, and every year they seem to build a bigger one. So all these things that we may think about as traditional domains of Americana are sort of on the decline right here in the United States. But despite Zakaria's critique, there is still one thing I believe that the U.S. possesses that is the envy of the world, and that is our top 50 research universities. They're unparalleled, and our public universities like UC's and UM's, the University of Michigan's, are the finest the world has ever seen. But the modern research university is not just a place for they're not just degree-granting institutions preparing students for the workplace. They're not just research institutions producing scholarship and analyses. They're not just places for sports and the arts, for socialization and skill building.